Hello tacticians! More great news! As many of you surely noticed, yesterday, I am writing this part of the script on the 7th of February, Snowprint announced more changes to some of the most notorious heroes and, well, look, if you're a regular, you know that I bash Snowprint every opportunity I get, but for once I approve of most of what I've seen. So yeah, I'm just as surprised as you are, okay? So what exactly seems to be going on? I'll try to sum it up, and do keep in mind this information is based on the announcements and explainers without any actual insider knowledge that the official content creators perhaps may have. So this is very much subject to change, and even my interpretations and understanding may simply be wrong. Keep that in mind. I'll have a short list of consequences for each of the three heroes mentioned in the announcements, that is Ragnar, Eldryon and Vitruvius, on screen for the duration of their respective rants. I'm sure I will miss some changed interactions, but that should be understandable with so many heroes in the game now. Brace yourself, here it comes! Changes to Ragnar. His active will newly no longer buff abilities and only buff normal attacks, and the damage component will be a flat boost instead of being percentage and capped at a value based. Depending on the new flat boost numbers, this will probably make it slightly weaker when working in conjunction with multiple buffers, like Calgar and Eldryon, but quite possibly stronger on its own when buffing heroes with lower base attack and multiple hits, such as Bellator. This, and a general change to the TA specifically, which now will prohibit using an ability twice per turn. The only other cases I can think of at the moment where this should be possible is Vindicta, who can also act after using her active, and maybe Caonalysis and Darkstrider, should lessen the impact of Ragnar teams in TA with melee heroes who have AoE abilities, Calgar, Mataneo, Janezar, Caoryn, or additional attacks from their passives. God's Will, Jaeger vs Overwatch, Caoryn, Row, being able to lose a hero or two and then still wipe the board reliably, or produce a devastating unavoidable alpha AoE strike, and this is actually one of the possible changes I envisioned in my reaction to the explainer video drop. I consider this a positive change to the TA on its own, but I still think TA is a Vomaria-inducing mode and should be made non-mandatory, as I also envisioned in the previous video. For raids, Ragnar is actually pretty much unchanged, depending on the size of the flat boost, as most of the damage from his Yif comes from himself anyway, and doesn't affect the remaining 5 turns of the fight, unless you're relying on him buffing Caoryn's active on the side. Changes to Eldryon. Let's face it, Eldryon's passive is game-breaking. Unlike most other buffers, such as Calgar or Thaddeus, it doesn't just increase the normal attack damage of allies in range, but instead it lets everyone deal more damage with everything, except for abilities that specifically do not benefit from buffs, such as Thaddeus' active. When only Eldryon is positioned correctly, which sets it about 2 orders of magnitude above other buffers, who usually only buff allies adjacent to them. Exceptions exist, but are still either range limited or time limited. As such, Eldryon is now an auto-include in most guild raid themes, and works extremely well in the arena, and while I do like using him for those reasons and will happily recommend everyone to build him as a high priority, I do think that this is a bad design choice. The new Eldryon will still buff abilities for the Eldari, so Maugan's and Janezar's actives, and Caonalysis' passive. Aethana's active doesn't benefit from buffs, but for everyone else, he will only buff their normal attacks. I assume this also includes Overwatch, because Overwatch should trigger a normal attack, even for Immospec and Rivas, and I'm not sure whether he will buff added hits, such as those from Thoriad and Vitruvius. I am assuming multi-component attacks, such as Rivas's or Burchard's normal attacks being immediately followed by a passive attack on the same target, will be partially buffed, and I highly encourage Snowprint to quadruple check that this works correctly. The TLDR from me at this point is that most multi-hit teams in raids, robots are an exception, are unaffected, unless the strength of Eldryon's buff also changes, because generally they use their normal attacks and not abilities. Ragnar should still benefit from Eldryon. Caoryn is very affected, only his original normal attack should benefit. Neurothrope teams are affected somewhat, Ahriman's active is affected and no longer benefits from Eldryon, not sure about the additional psychic hits from Abraxas's passive and Yazagor's active, but the loss there should be pretty minimal. Roswitha's torch no longer benefits, which is sad for fighting Magnus and Morty. Robots are quite affected. Ro himself loses about a third of his passive's damage, but the triggerers of the combos do not. Rivas and Galgords are affected because part of their normal attack damage comes from their passives. Not sure about Celestine's active being affected or not, because that one behaves weirdly. Jaeger's passive is, sadly, affected, and he will no longer be quite as fun to use against Poxwalkers and Bloodletters in the LREs. Burchard's active, as well as his normal attack, because part of it comes from his passive, are affected, and I'm pretty sure there are more changes. Changes to Vitruvius. Vitruvius's active ability will now suppress everything it hits, but will no longer apply the passive effect, which I think is the more important change of those two. With AdMax, you will probably not use Vitruvius's active to suppress Overwatch because of how clunky it is to use, because of its needs to charge up and to position correctly. Instead, the main benefit here is the slow and damage reduction, as well as the guaranteed radiation buff to reduce enemy armor and possibly to make Tangida's triggered summon attacks stronger when he is in his attack mode. And none of these will affect raid bosses. However, it may also be usable to discourage AI from putting units on the irradiated hexes if the AI considers them bad, like it does with Virus. I haven't experimented with that yet, but if it works, it may be a nice tactical option, and I would encourage Snowprint to indeed have units affectable by the irradiated hexes, that is, non-mechanicals and non-Death Guard, prioritize other hexes to move to instead. The passive ability will now basically put a debuff on the last enemy Vitruvius has normal attacked, which will cause all attacks, abilities included as per update notes from the 14th of January 2025, against them to deal +1 hit, except for those dealing psychic damage. And I am assuming this condition only considers the original damage types, and not attacks that have had extra psychic hits added from e.g. Abraxas's or Yazagor's abilities. Newly without a limit to the number of triggers per turn, and lasting until Vitruvius has attacked something else, or left the battlefield. Note that Vitruvius doesn't need to remain in range of the original target, or to reapply it every turn, making this an even more convenient, read potentially broken, buff than Eldryon's Doom. This is of course intended to synergize with Ro to replace Eldryon as the go-to buffer for AdMax, and unlike Thoriad's passive, which now works much the same way, will also buff the ranged attacks from, for example, Skitari, or much more interestingly, from Shosil's drones. We do not yet know the damage per hit cap, but I suspect it will be similar to Ro's passive, so capping somewhere around 3000 damage per hit, which is conveniently similar to Shosil's drone's attack value. Also worth mentioning here is that Tangida in his attack mode and Actus's active affect all mechanical summons, including Shosil's drones. Assuming Vitruvius's passive does cap out at the 3000 damage per hit, then Skitari benefit more from Eldryon, Show drones benefit more from Vitruvius, and Ro benefits more from Vitruvius. So summed up, this is looking like a further increase to the current highest damage team in raids, in theory at least. That seems power creepy again, and I think Snowprint should tune Vitruvius' passive so that the final damage output of robots with Vitruvius after the changes remains, at best, roughly the same as it is with Eldryon now. And you can bet that I will do a Grumpy Geezer yells at clouds! If this makes robots even more overperforming than they are now. Either way, this will not affect TA much, because in PvP stuff goes poof when Ro goes bonk 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 quickly, even without Eldryon or Vitruvius around. And like I said at the beginning of this segment, the change to Vitruvius' active seems inconsequential. Okay, that was a lot of talking for one day. As always, I'm looking forward to reading your comments and feedback. Personally, I think all the 3 heroes most affected by these changes, Ragnar, Eldryon, and Ro, should be nerfed a little in raids, despite having all 3 of them at Diamond 3. So, depending on the final Vitruvius' state, I welcome these changes. Even though you can argue that by making the few best heroes less viable, Snowprint is forcing us to build and thus buy resources for more teams. But then again, personally, I prefer the variety over having 2 meta teams that ruffle stomp everything, and once you have those built, you don't have a reason to build anyone else until the completely brand new meta faction drops and everyone rushes to buy that instead. How? I have spoken, Tactician!
If you enjoyed this video, like it, share it, subscribe to the channel, and watch the video again.